You ever have that one neighbor who makes you question your sanity just by existing? Yeah, mine's an HOA president named Karen. I swear she walks down our street like she's inspecting a private kingdom she personally built from scratch. Every morning she patrols the sidewalks, clipboard in hand, eyes darting at every crooked welcome mat, uneven flower bed, or slightly overgrown lawn. I've lost count of how many neighbors have been fined for trivial nonsense. One guy got a $50 penalty because his garden gnome's hat was tilted 3 degrees too far to the left. 3 degrees? I'm still not sure how anyone survives living here. That morning everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the scent of freshly mown grass filled the air. I was sipping my coffee on the porch, watching my kid ride his bike, thinking it was going to be another quiet day in our little cul-de-sac. But you know that feeling when something is off, like the air itself is holding its breath? Yeah, that was me. Karen was out front as usual, glaring at the street like it owed her something. She had on her signature blazer, probably ironed at least 3 times that morning, and sunglasses that screamed, "I'm judging you silently but effectively." She stopped in front of our neighbor's yard, tapped her clipboard, muttered something about unapproved mulch patterns, and then moved on. I made a mental note to avoid her path. Always a good strategy when dealing with a human who believes HOA rules are literally sacred laws of the universe. Little did I know that calm morning was about to turn upside down faster than you can say. Emergency protocol override. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I heard it, a scream. Not a regular "my kid just fell off his bike" scream. This was primal, gut-wrenching, the kind of scream that makes your chest tighten and your stomach drop. My heart skipped a beat. Instinctively, I leapt off the porch and ran toward the source. A crowd had started to gather near the end of the street, neighbors standing frozen, mouths open and eyes wide. That's when I saw it. Paramedics racing toward our cul-de-sac, lights flashing, sirens wailing, trying to navigate the narrow entrance. And standing right in the middle of the road, arms crossed like she owned the place, Karen. She didn't look concerned, she didn't look alarmed. She looked ready to lecture. As the ambulance approached, she held up her hand and said, in that calm but commanding tone that makes you want to throw something at her, "No vehicles are allowed on the street without HOA approval." I stopped dead. Did she just? My brain froze for half a second, then reality hit. There's a child, someone's life is at risk, and Karen is enforcing rules on the street, in real time, with sirens blaring. "Karen," I shouted, sprinting toward her. "Get out of the way, someone in serious danger." She tilted her head and gave me that look, the one that says, rules over reason every time. "I'm aware of the situation," she said smoothly, "but no exceptions without a form signed, notarized, and submitted in triplicate." Triplicate? At that moment, I was pretty sure the universe had a sick sense of humor. I glanced at the paramedics, their faces tight with urgency, stretching hoses and preparing their equipment. Every second felt like an hour. My mind raced. What kind of person blocks an ambulance? What kind of HOA president would actually do this? Then it hit me, this wasn't just a small-scale Karen meltdown. Something was different. There was a tension in her stance, a rigidness that seemed personal. I didn't know it yet, but that detail would matter later when the world around us exploded in ways no HOA fine ever could. For now, all I knew was the street, the sirens, Karen standing like a human barricade, and me caught between disbelief and sheer panic, wondering if bureaucracy had just collided with reality in the worst possible way. The calm of our quiet neighborhood, gone. In its place, a storm was brewing, and nobody, not even Karen, was going to escape it unscathed. I ran toward the end of the street, adrenaline pumping so hard I could feel it in my teeth. The sirens were deafening now, bouncing off the houses and echoing in my chest. Paramedics were sprinting from their ambulance, the stretcher unfolding like some kind of high-tech rescue platform. And there she was, Karen, standing there like a statue carved from pure stubbornness, sunglasses still on, clipboard clutched like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Karen, move," I shouted again, my voice cracking. "There's a kid in that ambulance, you have to let them through." She didn't flinch, she didn't even blink. She tilted her head slowly, like she was weighing my words against the HOA bylaws she carried in her head. "Rules are rules," she said, calm as if she were reciting a recipe for pie crust. "No one enters this street without prior authorization." I froze for a split second. Did she really just? My mind raced. Someone's life was at stake, and Karen was negotiating permits in her head. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was mouth the word, no. The paramedics started trying to reason with her, gesturing to the ambulance. "Ma'am, please step aside. This is an emergency." Karen shook her head. "Emergency or not, the street is private. Access is restricted." And that's when I noticed it, her body language had changed. Her stance wasn't just obstinate, it was tense. There was a stiffness in her shoulders, a trembling in her fingers as she gripped that clipboard. Something was off, but I didn't have time to think about it. Every second counted. I ran up to her, almost tripping over my own feet. "Karen, this isn't a drill. People's lives are on the line. Move your car, step aside, do whatever you have to do, but don't block the ambulance." She didn't move, she didn't even flinch. It was like talking to a wall with sunglasses and a god complex. The paramedics were now trying to maneuver the stretcher around her. She waved them off with a flick of her hand as if they were trespassers in her carefully curated kingdom. I glanced at the stretcher and my stomach dropped. Whoever was inside wasn't just hurt, they were pale, motionless, connected to tubes and monitors. The sirens were screaming, the EMTs were shouting, and Karen was holding the line. I tried reasoning again, my voice louder, desperate. "Karen, it doesn't matter about rules right now. Lives are at stake, please." She paused for a brief moment. I swear I saw a flicker of hesitation, and then she muttered something under her breath that made my stomach turn. "What?" I shouted. "You can't what?" But before she could answer, one of the paramedics leaned close and whispered something urgent to her. I didn't catch the words, but her face changed. For the first time, her perfect composure cracked. Her lips parted, her eyes widened behind those reflective lenses, and the clipboard nearly slipped from her hands. The world seemed to slow down. The sirens still screamed, the EMTs still worked frantically, and I could feel every second ticking like a drum in my chest. Karen's hand trembled as she raised it to wave the ambulance through, but she didn't step aside yet. I noticed neighbors peeking from their porches, mouths hanging open. A few whispered, "She's gone too far this time," while others just shook their heads. The tension in the street was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And then finally Karen spoke, but not in her usual commanding tone. It was quieter, almost broken. It's my daughter inside." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, the paramedics froze, the neighbors froze, and Karen, she went from villain to a woman paralyzed by fear, guilt, and disbelief. My mind reeled, her own daughter inside that ambulance. The very person she had been standing in front of and forcing rules over reason was the one she loved most. Everything shifted in an instant. What had started as absurd HOA stubbornness became real, raw, life-and-death panic, and just like that, the calm of our quiet street shattered completely. I glanced at the EMTs. They were waiting for Karen to move, for her to make a decision that could mean the difference between life and death. I glanced at Karen. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, and for the first time, the clipboard meant nothing. Time was running out, every second mattered. And somehow in that moment of absolute chaos, I realized we weren't just racing against the clock, we were racing against Karen herself. I could barely breathe, my heart was hammering like a jackhammer, and every instinct screamed at me to just grab Karen and shove her out of the way. But I knew that wouldn't work, not without escalating the chaos, and I also knew something had changed. That hesitation in her eyes, that subtle shake of her hand for the first time, Karen looked human, fragile, terrified, and utterly conflicted. The paramedics were shouting instructions now, but the situation was ridiculous. Here we were, standing in the middle of our perfectly manicured cul-de-sac, sirens wailing, lights flashing, and Karen arguing over rules, over access, over what, a private street? My brain tried to process it, but all I could think was, someone's life is literally hanging in the balance. I ran up to her, grabbing her arm gently but firmly. "Karen, listen to me, your daughter is inside that ambulance. She's struggling to breathe, you cannot block this." Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she gripped her clipboard tighter, her knuckles white. I swear it was the weirdest combination of authority and panic I'd ever seen. She looked like she wanted to cry, yell, and lecture someone all at the same time, and she couldn't decide which came first. The EMTs tried to maneuver the stretcher again, but she held up a hand. "Stop," she said, her voice cracked slightly. "I need to." "Need to what?" I shouted, stepping closer. "Time is running out, your daughter is in there, you need to move now." Neighbors had started gathering, peeking from behind curtains and over fences. Some were whispering, others were shaking their heads, probably wondering if they'd accidentally tuned into some surreal HOA drama meets disaster movie. One lady even muttered, "I can't believe she's doing this to her own child." I didn't blame her, I couldn't. Karen finally spoke, her voice trembling. "The rules, they're in place to protect everyone, She stopped. She looked down at the ground, her composure crumbling like dry soil in the sun. I felt a mix of disbelief and horror. "Are you kidding me?" I wanted to scream at her, but instead I forced myself to stay calm for her daughter's sake. "Karen, rules don't matter right now. This isn't about approvals, permits, or HOA bylaws. This is about your daughter. Move." For a split second, she froze again. I swear I could see her fighting some inner battle, like a tug-of-war between her obsessive control and basic maternal instinct. The ambulance crew glanced at each other, silently urging her to step aside. Every second felt like an eternity. And then something clicked. Her eyes darted toward the stretcher again. Her daughter's face, pale and strained, barely visible under the oxygen mask, made Karen's entire body tremble. I could see the fight in her eyes shift. Suddenly, this wasn't about rules anymore. This was about her child. The paramedic stepped closer, speaking firmly but calmly. "Ma'am, please move. We need to get her inside the ambulance now. Every second counts." Karen's hand wavered in midair as if unsure whether to obey, panic, or collapse on the spot. I grabbed her shoulders gently and looked into her eyes. "Karen, she's your daughter. This isn't about anyone else. Move now." Her composure shattered entirely. She stepped aside, dropping the clipboard. For a moment, she looked like she might collapse onto the ground, but at least she moved. The EMTs didn't waste a second. They wheeled the stretcher past her toward the ambulance as she stumbled back to the sidewalk, dazed. I exhaled so hard I thought I might collapse myself. The sirens, the yelling, the chaos, it was still there, but at least the immediate danger was being handled. I glanced at Karen, and for the first time she looked small, vulnerable, not the all-powerful HOA queen we'd all feared. She was human, terrified, guilty, and realizing just how wrong she had been. I wanted to say something comforting, but words felt useless. Instead, I watched as the paramedics loaded her daughter into the ambulance. Karen's eyes never left the stretcher, her hands trembling as she held herself up. The whole neighborhood was silent, everyone aware that what had just happened was surreal. And yet the suspense didn't end there, because even though the immediate crisis seemed to be under control, Karen's world had just shifted. The rules she worshipped, the control she clung to, none of it mattered anymore. And in that moment, I knew the storm was far from over. The ambulance doors swung open, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it felt like the world had slowed down. Paramedics were lifting the stretcher, their movements precise and urgent, but my eyes and everyone else's were fixed on Karen. She didn't move. She didn't shout. She didn't even blink. She just stared, frozen, as if the universe had pulled the rug out from under her feet. And then it hit me. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, and the color drained from her face like someone had hit a dimmer switch on her entire existence. I felt a chill crawl up my spine because suddenly everything made sense. The hesitation, the trembling hands, the way she'd clung to her clipboard like it could save her from reality. Her daughter, it was her daughter. I watched as Karen's knees buckled slightly, and she leaned against the nearest mailbox, trying to steady herself. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and she let out a strangled noise, part gasp, part sob. The realization had hit her like a freight train. The very rules she had been clinging to, the very authority she had wielded with such self-righteous fury, had almost cost her child's life. For a moment, the neighborhood was silent. The paramedics were focused on their task, but everyone else seemed frozen, watching a private tragedy unfold in front of their eyes. I could almost hear Karen's internal monologue. I almost, she couldn't finish the thought. No one could. I wanted to step forward to offer comfort or at least some semblance of understanding, but I knew that words were useless in that moment. This was a collision of her world and reality, a world she had controlled so meticulously, now crumbling under the weight of her own decisions. The EMTs gently lifted her daughter into the ambulance and started preparing her for transport. I noticed Karen's gaze locked on her child, tears welling up behind those reflective sunglasses. For once, her power, her authority, her control, it all felt meaningless. She was just a mother, terrified, guilty, and utterly helpless. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears as the paramedics worked, shouting brief instructions, checking monitors, adjusting oxygen. And all the while, Karen stood there, staring like a woman who had just glimpsed her own mortality through the most personal lens imaginable. One of the EMTs glanced at me and whispered, "She's stable for now." I nodded, barely able to process the relief washing over me, but the tension wasn't gone, it had shifted. What had been a battle between bureaucracy and urgency had become something deeper, a story of human vulnerability, guilt, and consequences. Karen finally spoke, her voice cracking like brittle glass. I didn't know, her words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. She had no idea she was putting her own daughter at risk, and now that realization was eating her alive. I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm but firm. "Karen, it's okay. What matters is that she's alive. That's all that matters right now." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now, and whispered, I almost killed her." It was hard not to flinch at that. I wanted to tell her it wasn't entirely her fault, she hadn't known. But the truth hung heavy in the air, it could have been. And the consequences of obsessing over rules instead of reality were laid bare right in front of the whole neighborhood. The ambulance team finished their checks, secured her daughter, and prepared to move. Karen's legs wobbled, but she managed to follow, walking alongside the vehicle like a woman in shock. Her hands kept brushing against the doors as if she could somehow transfer some of her panic into the metal panels. I glanced around at the neighbors. Some were whispering, some were shaking their heads, but everyone felt it. The raw, uncomfortable, suspenseful truth that life can turn on a dime, and even the most controlling person can be powerless when reality hits. As the ambulance doors closed, Karen sank into the nearest lawn chair, her face buried in her hands. I realized that the battle wasn't over, not for her, not for the neighborhood, not for anyone who had been watching this surreal, terrifying drama unfold. The calm of our street had shattered completely, and what remained was a tense, suspenseful aftermath filled with guilt, relief, and the unspoken question, what comes next? And in that quiet, tense moment, I understood something crucial. This wasn't just an HOA story. This wasn't just a tale of petty rules and absurd fines. This was a story about humanity, about how quickly life can teach you lessons you never expected to learn. And Karen, she was about to get the most intense lesson of all. The ambulance doors slammed shut, but the tension didn't ease, it only thickened. Every second felt like a countdown timer in my chest. Karen was slumped on the curb, her head in her hands, and yet I could feel that rigid, obsessive energy still lingering in the air like a storm cloud refusing to break. Her eyes darted toward the street repeatedly, still measuring, still calculating. I swear, even in panic, she was analyzing every inch of her kingdom. The EMTs jumped into action. They were efficient, moving with practiced urgency, checking monitors, adjusting oxygen, communicating in clipped, professional tones. The street that had been quiet just minutes ago was now a chaotic ballet of flashing lights, shouting voices, and the constant wail of the sirens. Every neighbor who had gathered had retreated to safe distances, watching like spectators at a suspenseful, unplanned drama. And then it happened. The stretcher, heavy and unwieldy, hit a small bump at the edge of the curb. One of the paramedics stumbled slightly, and for a heart-stopping instant, the back of the ambulance teetered as if the whole operation could collapse. My stomach dropped and I felt my knees weaken. Not now, not her, not after everything. I glanced at Karen. She had frozen, pale and motionless, still gripping her clipboard as if it were a lifeline. Her eyes were wide with terror. It was the first time I truly understood the depth of her panic. She wasn't thinking about rules anymore. She wasn't thinking about HOA bylaws, she was thinking about her child. Hold it steady, I shouted, moving closer to help without really thinking. My hands shook, my adrenaline spiking higher than it had all day. One of the paramedics barked at me to step back, but I ignored it. This was bigger than protocol. This was life and death. The stretcher finally made it inside the ambulance, but the chaos wasn't over. The paramedics were working feverishly, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals, and communicating with the hospital via radio. Every movement, every beep, every shout heightened the suspense. Karen was leaning over the open doors now, whispering something I couldn't hear, her face pressed against the glass. Her daughter's pale face, masked and unconscious, reflected back at her. I felt a pang of disbelief mixed with frustration. How had we gotten here? A simple neighborhood, an obsessive HOA president, a street, and a life hanging in the balance. It was absurd and terrifying all at once. I wanted to scream at her, "Do you see what you've done?" But the words wouldn't have mattered, she already knew. Neighbors murmured anxiously, some shaking their heads, others whispering prayers. The street had transformed into a high-stakes theater of suspense. A suburban nightmare turned into a life-or-death scene. Every passing second felt eternal. Then Karen's knees buckled. She sank to the curb again, sobbing openly, her perfectly pressed blazer wrinkled and smeared with sweat and tears. She had finally confronted reality, one that no rule, no fine, no regulation could fix. She had almost turned bureaucracy into tragedy. The paramedics finally secured her daughter, strapping her in, giving final orders. "We're moving her now," one shouted. The back doors slammed, lights flashed, and the ambulance started rolling slowly, carefully down the street. Every inch forward was a small victory, every second survived a triumph. I exhaled so hard I thought my lungs might collapse. The immediate threat had passed, but the tension lingered. Karen sat on the curb, staring after the ambulance, silent, broken, utterly shaken. I could see the guilt etched into every line of her face. The neighborhood had witnessed something extraordinary, the collision of control and consequence, authority and vulnerability. And yet the suspense wasn't over. Because while her daughter was now on the way to safety, Karen's reputation, her HOA authority, and the quiet balance of our neighborhood had all been shattered. The storm had passed physically, but the emotional fallout, the judgment, the shock, the unspoken horror was only beginning. I took a shaky step back, trying to process what had just happened. The absurdity of the situation still clung to me. A neighborhood feud turned near tragedy, an obsessed HOA president brought to her knees, and a child's life saved by sheer timing and courage. But one thing was clear, no amount of rules could ever outweigh the stakes of real life. And as the ambulance disappeared down the street, sirens fading into the distance, I realized the story was far from over. Karen's actions had consequences not just for her but for everyone who had witnessed the chaos. The suspense wasn't just in the moment, it was in what came next. The ambulance disappeared around the corner, sirens fading into a distant wail, but the tension on our street didn't ease, it morphed. It transformed into something heavier, something thick in the air that you could almost touch, guilt, fear, and disbelief. Karen was sitting on the curb, shoulders slumped, clipboard abandoned beside her like a useless shield. For once, she wasn't scolding anyone or enforcing her rules, she was just human, vulnerable, broken. I approached cautiously. Her eyes, rimmed red and wide with panic, flicked up at me. There was no defensiveness left, no arrogance, just raw terror. I didn't know, she whispered, voice trembling. I could feel a shiver crawl down my spine. It wasn't anger I felt, well, not entirely. It was the surreal mix of relief and horror that comes when something awful almost happens, and yet somehow, by the skin of our teeth, it didn't. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but honestly, how do you comfort someone who almost caused their own child's tragedy? Around us, the neighborhood was buzzing quietly, the kind of hushed murmuring that happens when everyone's witnessing a private apocalypse. Neighbors peeked over fences, exchanged glances, whispered to each other. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief, others, I could tell, were struggling not to laugh at the irony. And I couldn't blame them. The absurdity of it all, an entire emergency stopped by HOA rules, was almost laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Karen's hands shook as she clutched her head. I almost killed her, my own daughter, her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. The weight of that realization hung in the air like a storm cloud refusing to pass. I could feel it pressing down on all of us. I took a deep breath and stepped closer. Karen, it's okay, she's alive, that's what matters right now, the rest we can fix, the rest doesn't matter. She shook her head violently. You don't understand, I've always followed the rules, I've always done what I thought was right, and for what, for this? Almost losing my own child, I don't know if I can forgive myself. Her confession was raw, unfiltered, and chilling in its honesty. I wanted to say something soothing, but nothing seemed appropriate. Instead, I just nodded, letting her words hang there heavy and true. The neighbors had started to inch closer, sensing that this was a private moment unfolding publicly. One of them, Mrs. Callahan, who lived 2 doors down, muttered under her breath, well, I'll be damned, she's human after all. A ripple of quiet laughter ran through a few others. It was strange, but in a way, the humor helped cut the tension just enough to breathe. I couldn't stop my mind from replaying the scene over and over. Karen standing in the middle of the street, unwavering, while life itself raced past her in the form of flashing lights and wailing sirens. I remembered her trembling hands, her wide eyes, the split-second hesitation that had almost made the tragedy irreversible. And now, sitting on the curb, facing the aftermath, she was smaller than she had ever seemed. Finally, after what felt like hours, she lifted her head and met my gaze. I don't know how I'll face them, she whispered, meaning the neighborhood, the HOA, everyone. Everyone saw me almost destroy her. I swallowed hard. They'll understand. People make mistakes, serious mistakes, but you did what you could when it counted. You moved. You let the ambulance through. That's what matters. Her lips trembled, but there was a faint nod. Relief, guilt, shame, all tangled together in an emotional not too large for words. And yet the suspense wasn't gone. Because while her daughter had survived, while the immediate danger had passed, Karen's actions had left a mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The tension lingered in the neighborhood, a quiet reminder that the rules we cling to can sometimes blind us to reality and to what truly matters. I looked around. The street was quiet again, the neighbors slowly returning to their yards, murmuring, whispering, processing. But Karen remained on the curb, curled into herself, a woman stripped of authority, left only with the raw, uncomfortable truth. And I knew with absolute certainty that the fallout was just beginning. The calm was gone, the street would never be the same, and neither would Karen. By the time the ambulance disappeared down the winding road, the street was quiet, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Karen was still on the curb, staring at the empty street as if it had swallowed her entire world. But it wasn't just her I was thinking about. Everyone had witnessed the chaos, the near tragedy, the sheer absurdity of an HOA president almost letting bureaucracy dictate life and death. And now, the reckoning had to come. Word had spread quickly. Within minutes, neighbors were gathering, murmuring, eyes wide, whispers floating in the air like wildfire. Some were curious, some judgmental, and a few, God bless them, were barely holding back laughter. I could feel the electricity of anticipation, like everyone was waiting to see how Karen would respond when confronted with the truth of her actions. Karen looked up when the first neighbor approached. Her face was pale, her hair slightly disheveled, and her perfectly pressed blazer wrinkled in ways that could only happen during a genuine meltdown. She straightened, trying to regain control, but the effort was pitiful. The composure, the authority, the iron grip she had over this neighborhood, it had crumbled. "Karen," Mrs. Callahan said, voice calm but firm, "you realize what you just did." Karen swallowed hard. "I didn't know it was her, I mean." Her voice cracked under the weight of reality. She couldn't finish her sentence. A few more neighbors had joined, forming an unofficial council of judgment. "You nearly blocked an ambulance, Karen," one man said, tone incredulous. "Your own daughter was in it." Karen's hands trembled as she adjusted her sunglasses, though it did little to hide the guilt etched into her face. "I was following the rules," she whispered, the words almost pathetic in their futility. "Rules are there for a reason." "They are," I shouted, stepping forward. "But when someone's life is on the line, rules are meaningless. Do you understand that? Your obsession almost cost your child everything." Her head drooped and she sat back down on the curb, covering her face with her hands. The neighborhood was silent except for the occasional sniffle, the quiet hum of disbelief, and the distant wail of sirens fading into the distance. I glanced at her, realizing this was more than humiliation. This was the collapse of the entire persona she had built around herself. For years, she had been untouchable, enforcing HOA rules like sacred law, wielding authority like a weapon. And now her own actions had exposed her as just a person, vulnerable, fallible, terrified. One neighbor spoke up, voice tight with emotion. "You need to understand that life isn't a set of rules, Karen. It's messy, it's unpredictable. And you almost destroyed something precious because you couldn't see past your own regulations." Karen didn't respond. She just rocked back and forth slightly, shaking her head, lips trembling. I could see the shame written on every line of her face. Her power, her influence, her self-righteous authority, they had evaporated in the span of an ambulance ride. A few of the braver neighbors continued, some with anger, some with incredulity. "How can we trust you anymore?" one asked. "How do we know you won't do something like this again?" Karen's voice was barely audible, trembling and broken. "I will never, I didn't know." I could feel the suspense thickening. Everyone in the neighborhood knew she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The moment was tense, awkward, and heavy with judgment. It wasn't a lawsuit, it wasn't the police, it was something far worse. The silent verdict of everyone who had once followed her, feared her, or respected her authority. Finally, after what felt like hours, she lifted her head. Tears streaked her face, mascara running, lips quivering. I failed," she whispered, not to me, not to the neighbors, to herself. And in that instant, the suspense reached its peak. Karen had faced the full consequences, not legal, not bureaucratic, but human. Public scrutiny, personal guilt, the stark reality of what nearly happened. Her empire of rules had crumbled and the neighborhood had seen it all. I took a deep breath. The storm was not fully over, but the lesson had landed. Karen would never look at rules the same way again. She would never forget the terror, the panic, the helplessness she felt that day. And the rest of us, well, we would never let her forget it either. As I stepped back, surveying the silent street, I realized something profound. This wasn't just an HOA story anymore. It was a story about control, consequence, and humility, the kind that leaves you breathless, reflective, and a little shaken. Karen had survived the storm, but the neighborhood and her daughter would ensure she would never act the same way again. The suspense lingered in the air, thick, palpable, reminding everyone that rules are nothing compared to life. The street was quiet now, but it wasn't peaceful. The tension still hung in the air like fog over a lake at dawn, thick, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Karen sat on the curb, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her empire of rules, fines, and iron-fisted authority had crumbled in the span of an ambulance ride. And as I watched her, I realized something important. This wasn't just about the rules. It was about life, consequence, and the moments that strip even the most controlling person down to raw humanity. Neighbors had slowly dispersed, murmuring quietly to each other, still in disbelief. Some were shaking their heads, others were whispering sarcastic comments under their breath. I couldn't help but smirk a little because, let's be honest, there's a certain dark humor in watching the neighborhood tyrant confronted by reality in the most personal way possible. But it was tempered by relief. Her daughter was safe, and that was the only victory that truly mattered. Karen finally lifted her head, mascara streaked down her cheeks, sunglasses discarded. Her eyes were red, glassy, and wide with the full realization of what had almost happened. She began, voice trembling. I can't believe I almost, she stopped, unable to finish the thought. The words hung in the air like jagged glass. I took a cautious step toward her, my voice steady but gentle. Karen, your daughter is alive, that's what matters. Nothing else does, not the rules, not the fines, not the approvals, nothing. She shook her head slowly, tears falling freely now. I've never felt so powerless, she admitted. It was strange, hearing her confess weakness after years of witnessing her wield authority like a weapon. All those rules, all that control, and it nearly killed the one person I love most. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. There's nothing like a near tragedy to strip away the illusion of control. Life doesn't follow rules, Karen, I said quietly. It's messy, unpredictable, and sometimes the rules you cling to can blind you to what's really important. She looked at me, a glimmer of humility finally piercing through the panic and guilt. I think I understand now, she whispered. I never thought I thought rules were safety, but they're not always. I allowed a small smile. Exactly, safety isn't paperwork or approvals, it's paying attention, it's common sense. It's knowing when to bend the rules for the right reason. There was a pause, a quiet that felt almost sacred. The street, once dominated by petty HOA power plays, was now still. We were all suspended in that moment, the calm after a storm, heavy with lessons learned and consequences acknowledged. And then, in a moment of absurdity that could only happen in a story like this, Karen muttered under her breath, almost to herself, I should have known even my rules couldn't save me from my own daughter. A few neighbors snickered quietly, and I let out a soft laugh too. Even in the middle of disaster, there was a tiny flicker of humor, because irony, cruel as it is, has a way of sneaking in when you least expect it. Eventually, she stood up slowly, unsteady but determined, and glanced at the street around her. I need to make amends, she said. To everyone, to my daughter, to, well, everyone. I nodded. That's a good start, the rest will follow. Her transformation wasn't instant, and I knew she would never be the same Karen again. The street would remember what happened today, the chaos, the terror, the near tragedy, and the irony of a tyrant brought low by life itself, and in a strange way it was a relief. Because the rules that had once felt oppressive now seemed almost insignificant compared to the lessons we'd all learned, about compassion, awareness, and priorities. As I walked back to my porch, sipping the now cold coffee I had abandoned hours ago, I glanced at Karen. She was still standing, staring at the street, silent, contemplative. I knew she would be different now. Smarter, humbler, and hopefully wiser. And maybe, just maybe, the street would be a little safer. Not because of rules enforced with fear, but because people finally understood what mattered most. Life, family, and the moments that remind you rules aren't everything. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. The chaos had passed, but the story would linger. Karen's empire of rules had crumbled, but something far more important had been rebuilt. Awareness, empathy, and the understanding that control is meaningless when life itself is at stake. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet settle around me. The street would never be the same, and neither would Karen's. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.